My story is a testimony of what God can do with an ordinary life. It doesn't begin with promises or certainties, but with hunger and despair. I had no easy choices, no secure path. I was a young widow in a foreign land, nameless and without a future, in a place scorched by the sun and by need. My journey was marked by suffering and death, leading to a destiny I never imagined, to become part of a lineage that would change the world. This is the story of how faith and divine grace can transform even the most unlikely lives into something splendid and extraordinary. The heat of Moab was suffocating, and it seemed like even the land had given up the fight. Hunger had turned our city into a place of murmurs and empty stares. The harvests failed, and the future seemed like a broken promise. It was in this setting that they arrived, a foreign family from Bethlehem. Elimelech, the head of the family, had the gaze of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions, but carrying the weight of each one. Naomi, his wife, appeared resilient, but her eyes revealed deep sorrow. Their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, were young, yet their faces bore the marks of the journey that had brought them here. I remember watching them at the city market, trying to barter with what little they had. It was there that Mahlon and I met for the first time. He had a soft voice and a kindness that contrasted with the world around us. It was this kindness that captivated me. We married, despite the differences between our peoples. It wasn't a grand wedding, but it was full of hope. We lived modestly, but happily. However, that happiness was short-lived. First, Elimelech died. Then Chilion. And finally, Mahlon. I remember the silence of our house after his death, as if life itself had walked out the door. Naomi, Orpah, and I stayed together for a while, trying to figure out what to do. Naomi seemed crushed by the weight of her losses, but one day she rose with a determination I hadn't expected. "The Lord has visited his people and brought them bread," she said. "I will return to Bethlehem." She encouraged us to go back to our families. Orpah cried, but after much insistence, she gave in and stayed. I, however, couldn't leave. "Ruth, go back to your mother's house," Naomi said, her voice choked. "You're young. You can marry again, start a new life. I have nothing to offer. I have no more sons, no future. Go back." Her words were full of logic, but something inside me resisted. I knew my life in Moab would never be the same. And beyond that, there was Naomi's God. Even in her pain, she spoke of him in a way that made me believe he was different from the gods I had known. "Do not urge me to leave you," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "Where you go, I will go, where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Naomi looked at me with tears in her eyes. She knew there was no point in arguing. We walked together to Bethlehem, in silence for much of the way. The nights on the road were cold, and the silence of the hills only intensified our worries. Sometimes, Naomi would speak of Bethlehem, describing the fields and the people who lived there. But there was a melancholy in her voice, as if she no longer believed she belonged to that place. When we finally arrived, we were greeted with curiosity. The women of the city whispered among themselves. "Is this Naomi?" they asked, shocked by her worn appearance. "Do not call me Naomi," she said firmly, interrupting their conversations. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." I stood by her, but no one seemed to notice. It was as if I were invisible, a shadow in the background. I was just the Moabite. In the following days, Naomi remained silent, consumed by her grief. I knew I had to do something, but the uncertainty of how I would be accepted in a foreign land left me hesitant. It was then that, one morning, I made a decision. I looked at Naomi and said, "I will go to the fields. Perhaps I will find favor somewhere and gather the leftover grain." She nodded, her expression cautious. And so, with the little we had, I began to seek what we needed to survive. The sun was high when I arrived at the fields of Bethlehem. The heat was familiar, but the landscape was different from Moab. The fields stretched like a golden sea, full of workers harvesting wheat with rhythm and precision. It was a scene of abundance, but I knew the bounty was not for me. I kept to the sidelines, watching the reapers. After taking a deep breath, I entered the field and began gathering the ears of grain left behind. It was slow work, each ear seeming like a little treasure. As I bent down, I felt eyes on me. The presence of a foreigner did not go unnoticed. Some of the workers whispered among themselves, but no one approached. I kept my focus on the work, knowing that my survival and Naomi's depended on it. "Who is this young woman?" A man's voice broke the silence around me. I looked up and saw a tall man with a posture that exuded authority, but without arrogance. "She's the Moabite who returned with Naomi," one of the servants answered, his tone carrying more judgment than information. My heart raced. I knew what it meant to be the Moabite here, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. I braced myself for the worst, but to my surprise, the man walked toward me with firm steps. "I've heard of you," he said, his voice calm but full of intention. "You left your land, your family, and your gods to follow Naomi and trust in the God of Israel. May the Lord reward you for that." His words left me speechless for a moment. He spoke with a kindness I hadn't expected. When I finally found my voice, it almost failed me. "Thank you, my lord." He gave a slight smile and introduced himself as Boaz, the owner of the field. He gave instructions to his servants, ensuring that I could glean in peace and even drink the water brought by the workers. Before leaving, he looked at me again. "Don't worry, you're under my protection here." That night, I returned home with more than I had hoped for. When Naomi saw the basket full of grain, her eyes widened. "Where did all this come from?" she asked, surprised. "From the field of a man named Boaz," I replied, feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. Naomi fell silent for a moment, and then a smile began to form on her lips. "Boaz. He's one of our close relatives, a redeemer." I didn't fully understand what that meant, but the tone of hope in Naomi's voice made me believe that something was changing. The days in Boaz's fields became a routine for me. Each day, I returned home with more than I expected, thanks to his generosity. Even without fully understanding his actions, I felt that his kindness was genuine. Naomi watched everything closely. One evening, while we were having dinner, she set her plate aside and looked at me with an intensity one had never seen before. "My daughter, it's time to secure a future for you," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. He can get us out of this situation. But we need to act," she replied, a glint of determination in her eyes. She explained the plan. I was to wait until Boaz finished his work and rested in the field. When he was asleep, I was to approach, uncover his feet, and ask him to spread his cloak over me. It was a symbolic act, a way of asking him to take responsibility for redeeming our family. "Isn't this wrong?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "It's bold," Naomi admitted. "But Boaz is a righteous man. He will understand." That night, I waited until the field was silent and dark. The glow of the stars lit up the sky, and the sound of the wind among the grain filled the air. My heart raced as I approached Boaz, who was sleeping near a pile of grain. Carefully, I knelt beside him and lifted the cloak covering his feet. He stirred, and then his eyes opened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firm but not hostile. "I am Ruth, your servant," I replied, trying to remain calm. "Spread your cloak over me, for you are a redeemer." For a moment, he remained silent, and I feared the worst. But then, a gentle smile appeared on his face. "You could have sought someone younger," he said. "But you chose what is right. Don't worry. I will do what you have asked. But there is another relative who has the first right. Tomorrow, we will settle this." His eyes conveyed sincerity, and something inside me calmed. When I returned home before dawn, I told Naomi everything. "Now wait," she said. "Boaz is a man of his word. He won't rest until this is resolved." As the sun began to rise, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The future was out of my control, but I knew it was in the hands of someone I could trust, both Boaz and the God of Israel. The dawn in Bethlehem seemed brighter that day, but my mind was consumed with uncertainty. As Boaz went to address the issue of the right of redemption, I stayed at home with Naomi. She tried to occupy herself by organizing the house, but her eyes revealed the same anxiety I felt. "He will keep his word," she said, perhaps to reassure me or herself. Boaz is a man of integrity. If anyone can resolve this, it's him. At the city gate, where important decisions were made, Boaz gathered the elders and the other closest relative. This man had the first right to redeem Naomi's land and, consequently, marry me to preserve Mahlon's name. In the presence of these witnesses, Boaz began, with his firm and confident voice, I want to present the case of Naomi, who has returned from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. You have the priority right to redeem it. Will you do so? The other man seemed interested. Yes, I will redeem it, he replied promptly, without hesitation. My heart sank when I heard this. For a moment, it seemed that all was lost. But Boaz, ever wise, continued. However, know that by redeeming the land, you also take Ruth, the widow of Mahlon, to preserve the name of the deceased in his inheritance. The man stopped. He frowned, clearly troubled by what this implied. He looked around, as if seeking an escape. This would jeopardize my own inheritance, he finally said. I cannot redeem it. With this statement, Boaz seized the moment to formalize his decision. He declared before all present, I will redeem the land and take responsibility for Ruth, the widow of Mahlon. To seal the agreement, the other man removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz, as per custom. With that, the transaction was complete. Boaz was now my redeemer. The news reached Naomi and me quickly. When she told me, her joy was contagious. He has done this for us, Ruth. He chose to redeem us. This is not just duty. It's kindness. Tears filled my eyes. Boaz had seen value in me, a foreigner. He had made a decision that changed not only my future, but Naomi's as well. The celebration that followed Boaz's and my wedding was simple, but full of joy. The people of Bethlehem, who had once looked at me with suspicion, now gathered to bless us. May the Lord make this woman like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel, the women said, their voices full of enthusiasm. Boaz was an exemplary husband. He not only treated me with kindness but also made sure to include me in every aspect of his life. For the first time, I felt I truly belonged in this place. When our son was born, it seemed like the cycle of our lives had come full circle. We named the boy Obed, and he brought renewed joy to everyone, especially Naomi. Naomi held Obed in her arms as if he were the greatest of treasures. The women of the city murmured with joy, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today. May this boy become famous in Israel. For me, Obed was not just my son. He was a testimony of God's faithfulness. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of how God transformed my pain into joy and my shame into honor. I later learned that Obed would grow up to be the grandfather of David, the greatest king of Israel. From his lineage would come the Messiah, the one who would bring redemption not only to Israel but to the entire world. As Naomi held Obed, her words were profound. The Lord has restored my life through this boy. I saw in her eyes something I had never seen before, peace. The woman who once called herself bitter, now radiated a renewed sweetness. My own journey of faith was also complete. The God I barely knew in Moab had guided me to this land and included me in his eternal story. He not only gave me a new beginning, he gave me a purpose greater than I could have imagined. At the end of that day, as I cradled Obed, I looked at Boaz and Naomi and silently thanked the Lord. He had transformed not only our circumstances but also our hearts. Years passed, and my son Obed grew up strong and full of life. Every time I saw him running through the fields I once harvested with trembling hands, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was the embodiment of God's goodness and faithfulness in my life, a testament to the truth that the Lord can transform the most unlikely circumstances into something glorious. I often sat in the evenings, watching Boaz work alongside our servants and listening to Obed's laughter. Those moments of stillness led me to reflect on how it all began. My journey began in Moab, a dry land full of gods that could not hear or respond. My marriage to Mahlon gave me a glimpse of something different, the faith in the God of Israel. But in loss and grief, my faith was tested. Naomi, with her deep sorrow, was a living witness to how difficult it is to trust in God during times of pain. When I decided to follow her to Bethlehem, it was an act of faith, though I did not fully understand it. I knew I was leaving behind everything I knew, But I also knew that Naomi's God was different. He was not like the gods of my homeland. He seemed to care about the lives of people, even the most insignificant. Over time, I realized that he truly is a God of redemption. He not only restored my life but gave me a place in his eternal story. Through Boaz, he rescued me from the shame of being a foreigner with no future. Through Obed, he placed me in the lineage of kings and eventually, of the Messiah himself. When the women of Bethlehem come to me and say, "Your story will be told for generations," I smile. I know they are right. Not because of who I am, but because of the God who called me and included me in his great work of salvation. I remember nights when I felt invisible, just the Moabite. Today, I know that God never considered me insignificant. He saw me, called me, and gave me a role greater than I could have imagined. As I look at Obed, I think about what he will mean for future generations. He will grow up to be the grandfather of David, the king chosen by God. And far beyond that, one day, a Savior will be born from that same lineage. A Savior who will bring redemption to the world, just as he brought it to me. I am just a small, but significant part of that story. My prayer is that those who hear of me see the God who redeems the broken, transforms the invisible, and makes all the unlikely instruments of his grace. One night, sitting next to Naomi as she cradled Obed, I said, "You were right when you asked me to trust in the God of Israel. He has not only given us new life, he has given us purpose." Naomi smiled, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Ruth, you are the living proof that God sees beyond what the world sees. He is faithful." And so, my story, which began in pain and uncertainty, became a testimony of God's infinite grace. It is not just mine. It is the story of all who dare to trust in a God who never abandons us and always redeems us. If Ruth's story has inspired you, imagine uncovering the virtues of other extraordinary women in the Bible who, like her, faced incredible challenges with unwavering faith and courage. Our ebook, The Virtues of Women in the Bible, Timeless Lessons from Modern Life, dives deep into the lives of Hannah, Esther, Abigail, Ruth, and Mary, offering practical reflections and timeless wisdom to guide you in your own journey. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the first pinned comment to access this powerful resource and let their lessons transform your life today.